Welcome to this webinar. Today, the topic of our discussion is mental health in UK. We received two great speakers, Amy Hardy from King's College London and Diane Pochard from Department of Health and Social Care, both working in London, United Kingdom. So we're happy to welcome you today in this unusual full English-speaking webinar to hear news from UK in digital health and digital mental health. So it's interesting for us from Quebec to hear from UK because the famous Improving Access to Psychological Therapies program that has been, I suppose, more than 10 years ago started in the UK has been seen as a very innovative initiative about how to improve access to healthcare and specifically access to psychotherapy. And this program is inspiring a similar program in Quebec for a few years now, which name is Programme québécois pour les troubles mentaux. And it's interesting to hear some news also from that too. So we received today Amy Hardy. She will present her work about the Slow-Mo project, which is a hybrid intervention that combines face-to-face interviews and a web platform, and which is dedicated to adults facing psychosis troubles. And then after that, we will hear also a presentation from Diane about how to use how to use human-centered design in order to create more inclusive digital health service. So what is very interesting for us is that you are two of the few people around the world who tries to connect design, mental health, or health and the digital technologies. We are not a lot of people and working on those topics around the world as far as we know. So it's very exciting to welcome you here. And I'm looking forward to listening to you. So we will start right now with your first presentation, Amy. So normally I configured the Zoom so that you are both a co-host, so you should have access to all the screen sharing features and everything. So feel free to use it. And I'm going to close my microphone during the presentation and let you speak. So Amy, thank you for being there. And now it's your turn.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I share the pleasure in being able to join with others who are working in a similar field. So yeah, it's a real honour to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. So as Stefan has said, my plan was to speak to you about how myself and my colleagues have gone about harnessing inclusive human-centered design to try and improve outcomes for talking therapy for psychosis. And I've done this work particularly with the Slow-Mo co-founders, Professor Philippa Garrity and Dr. Tom Ward. So what's the background to Slow-Mo then? Why did we develop it? Well, the context in the UK is that we know that psychosis is a significant problem. So schizophrenia spectrum disorders, which is the most sort of severe form of psychosis diagnostically, have significant personal, societal and economic costs. Psychosis is also common in the general population and common mental health problems, despite traditional conceptualizations of psychosis. So there's a significant need there. The challenge is that our current treatments are lacking. So medication is the mainstay treatment, but we know that side effects are common, which can impact adherence. And even when people do adhere, treatment response can be lacking or kind of partial or not there. Psychological therapies have also been developed over the last 2 decades for psychosis, and Philippa, our co-founder, has been a pioneer in the UK of developing cognitive behaviour therapy for psychosis, which is recommended by our National Institute for Care and Clinical Excellence. The problem is that only about 1/4 of people who are eligible are able to access it, and that's due to it being costly to train up therapists to do it and to deliver it. And in IAPT, which was previously mentioned, there's no provision of psychological therapy for psychosis. Even when people can access therapy, the effects are often quite modest as well. We have similar problems with engagement and adherence as with medication. What's particularly concerning is that we know that people from marginalised groups, and specifically people from our Black communities, have a higher incidence of psychosis, but that's coupled with poorer access to treatment, poor experiences of treatment, and poorer outcomes. And so whilst these groups have kind of traditionally been referred to as hard to reach, as this kind of graphic shows here, perhaps a problem is more that they are seldom heard and our services haven't been developed in such a way as to meet their needs, so that people are able and willing and able to engage with therapy. So how did we go about kind of tackling this in relation to our development of slow-mo? Well, arguably any healthcare intervention works by targeting the key mechanisms that might improve outcomes. And in clinical psychology or mental health research, primarily the main way of doing this has been to conduct clinical research to identify biopsychosocial mechanisms that play a role in problems and antidote mechanisms that might help to ameliorate them. And whilst this is certainly a really valuable kind of route to improving our interventions, it's arguably only one side of a coin, because I think I probably don't need to try too hard to convince you, given that we're in a design seminar, that it's not important just what we do, but how we go about doing it. And so the other side of the coin then is around employing design research, or specifically inclusive human-centered design in the case of slow-mo, to try and improve the usability of our interventions. Because if we can better target or optimize processes like attention, memory, motivation, then that's likely to also potentially improve our outcomes. So this is the approach we took with slow-mo. So this is an overview of the slow-mo platform. In its current form, it consists of a web app that supports the delivery of 8 face-to-face sessions with a therapist. And these are synchronized with a native mobile app for the person to use in between sessions and after therapy has ended. In terms of the psychological mechanism that slow-mo targets, it focuses on fast thinking. So the evidence, we have robust evidence that fast thinking plays a causal role in fueling people's worries. And by that, I mean our tendency to go with our gut instinct, to not consider alternative explanations, and to reason based on intuition. But that slow thinking, and by that I mean the kind of effortful, deliberative, kind of reflective process we engage in, where we gather more information and we think things through, can be an antidote to that and to help people manage their worries and feel safer. And so the early versions of slow-mo focused on targeting fast thinking and seeing if slow thinking did indeed work as an antidote. And we had, position we were in about 10 years ago was we had evidence that perhaps this kind of targeted approach might be a way of improving therapy outcomes. We were at the stage then when we were thinking about, in line with our Medical Research Council guidelines for developing complex interventions, moving on to doing an evaluation, so a randomized control trial, which if effective could then move on to implementation. But what we did before going on to an RCT, so taking a slightly a step change approach, was to have an intermediary step of conducting another feasibility study using design research. And the reasons for doing this was to really try and enhance the intervention as much as possible to address those barriers to implementation. So we wanted to make a version of the therapy that was more accessible, engaging, and easier to use, so that when we, if it were effective in an RCT, it would be more likely to be able to scale up in the real world, because we know that many healthcare interventions fail at the point of implementation, even if they've been efficacious in an RCT setting. Now, Stefan asked me to speak to a little bit about why our team was so interested in design research, and it is something that I kind of led with our group and really encouraged the group to adopt. And for me, this slide kind of encapsulates why, as a clinician, I think design is so critical to our work. So this slide shows here something called a thought record. It's probably the most commonly used artifact in CBT internationally. There's numerous versions of it available in different forms, but I hope from kind of, and what it aims to do is to support people with that process of stepping back from a difficult or distressing situation, identifying why it was difficult in terms of a thought, thinking that through, and hopefully reaching a more helpful conclusion. And that's a helpful process that is arguably core to many psychological therapies. The problem, I would argue, is that this is an artifact to support that process is arguably not fit for purpose for the range of people we see. We know in the UK, the average reading age is 9 years. We know that people need to use these kinds of forms in moments of peak distress, and it's not very user-friendly to be getting out a bit of paper and trying to write things down when you're in a distressing or a difficult situation. So, and I clinically had always tried to personalize and adapt these kinds of artifacts, but I felt there was so much more we could do if we were trying to really optimize our clinical interventions. And so that's where the kind of a desire for bringing in the design research came from. And this increasingly, you know, as we sort of heard, it's a small movement, but I think increasingly is gaining traction in evidence-based practice. I think it does create some interesting tensions in terms of the assumptions of design research and the assumptions of certainly clinical trials, and maybe we can get into some of that in the discussion. So for our other side of the coin, then, thinking about the design research, we worked with the Helen Hamlin Centre for Design based at the Royal College of Art. We, as I said, used an inclusive human-centred design approach. And for us, that was particularly important given our population and given what we know about minoritized groups being having inequitable access, experience and outcomes. We wanted to make sure we overcame the risk inherent in conventional participatory design, that those people who are most kind of willing and able or vocal are more likely to have their voices heard, and that you might miss voices from other people. So we did that then by purposefully sampling people at the extremes of distributions we knew were relevant to the therapy. So for example, motivation to engage in therapy, severity of paranoia, attitudes towards using technology, and also a real wide range of demographics. And you can read more about our design approach here. We use the UK Double Diamond, Design Council Double Diamond method to develop the therapy. And this illustration kind of visualizes the main design methods and techniques that we used at each stage of the work. So starting off by desk research, interviews, observations of the previous versions of slow-mo, mapping the context in which therapy is delivered. And that led to us kind of developing our design brief or our design brief or design definition. So we wanted to develop a next generation of CBT for psychosis that would assist personalization, provide tailored support, promote pleasure and trust, reduce information processing demands, and support memorability. So really focusing on kind of the how of how we were going about delivering the therapy. So from that design brief, we then developed a whole range of concepts which we kind of iteratively whittled down with our SLOMO co-design participants, and that led to us eventually developing the SLOMO platform. And you might have spotted from when I showed the overview of the platform, one of the key design concepts within SLOMO is this idea of representing worries as, or thoughts as bubbles, because this communicates the sense that, that our fast thinking habits might fuel our worries, but by taking a moment to slow down, we might be able to find ways of feeling safer and living well. Another key concept within SLOMO is the idea of therapy as a journey. So each of the modules is kind of navigated through this journey home screen. The early sessions, as is typical in CBT, support people to focus on noticing and understanding their worries, and then the later sessions move on to kind of change strategies. Just to showcase a few other features of the software, so here we have how the app and the web app support people to notice their thinking habit in a way that's much more kind of accessible than conventional pen and paper approaches. Collaborative formulation, so developing understanding of someone's problems, is a cornerstone of CBT, and using this kind of digital interface provides, with a bubble representation, provided again a much more sort of inclusive way for us to work on that with people during therapy. We also follow Sam, Nadia and James throughout the therapy, who provide simple stories to explain their worries and what helps them to slow down. So for example, the user here might be selecting James and hearing from James about how experiences of feeling excluded in the past fed into him feeling excluded and worried about other people's intentions in the here and now. There's also co-produced learning tasks which support people to learn strategies for slowing down, which they then apply outside of sessions. And each of the sessions from kind of session 4 onwards is anchored around a SLOMO, at least one SLOMO tip. So highlighting kind of common cognitive biases or distortions that we can all use, which might inadvertently end up fueling our worries. I wanted to play you here now an animation of, this is someone from our SLOMO RCT talking about his experiences of using the SLOMO mobile app between sessions to manage one of his worries. And we'll call this client Alex. I'd like to thank Alex for letting us share his experiences. And Alex is quite typical of somebody who we've used SLOMO with. So a Black British man in his 30s, diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, and he'd been in contact with services for over 10 years, but had never been offered any kind of psychological therapy. So it would be great if we could pause recording here just before I play the animation of Alex. Thank you.
Yeah, give me 1 second. Yes, so now
I'll
should
finish off.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, just to finish off briefly by letting you know sort of where we got to with SLOMO. So we did publish a RCT last year of the SLOMO trial, which was the largest trial of its type in the NHS. We were very pleased that we found effect sizes that were equal to or better than a comparable therapy and more efficiently, so in less duration. And pleasingly, in terms of the inclusive human-centered design, we also found evidence that SLOMO bridged the digital divide. So baseline differences in relation to digital literacy for Black people and older people didn't translate to engagement, outcomes, or user experience. So we are now, as planned, moving to implementation. We're working with another design studio in order to develop version 2 of SLOMO, building on learning and user feedback from a trial. We think we can optimize it even further to really boost engagement and use in real world settings. And our hope is to scale up slow-mo in the NHS within 5 years. And we're also exploring international dissemination as well. So I just want to finish by thanking the slow-mo team. It's very much been a huge collective team effort of software developers, people with lived experience, designers, clinicians, and ourselves as clinician academics, and also thank all the organisations that have been involved in the work, and of course yourselves for listening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was an amazing presentation, and to see the platform itself working with this testimonies of concerned people using it. Very, very inspiring. I think we all have a few questions. Maybe I can start. Just to be sure I understood it correctly. So when someone uses the app and has some fears and bad thoughts and this kind of thing, so then the person acquires new capacity to think more safely, because the phone is offering thoughts that the person has lost the ability to have by herself or by himself, if I understand it correctly, right? So instead of being able by myself to stop like fears of worries, then the app will offer me alternative thinking that I can rely on, so that I can avoid my fears. Is that correct? What I understand?
Yes, although I'd say within that, the alternatives, there's two parts to that process. It's partly that the app supports people, first of all, to slow down their thinking. So to pause, to take a moment, to take another look at what's actually going on. So that's kind of the thinking process, the reasoning process. And that's where you saw the slowing down bubble. That's the kind of prompt to do that. Take a moment, look around. And I didn't show all the slowing down screens in that animation, but there's then screens that follow it that encourage people to reflect on what have you now noticed. And people can audio or text record it. And then people have the option to say, well, what's your alternative thought now? So that's the second bit, when you then reach an alternative conclusion. But those alternative thoughts are generated within therapy, so within the sessions, and then they populate on the mobile app for people to then access. Or people can generate their own outside of sessions and add them to the app. And the slow-mo tips that I shared are what support people with that process of slowing down, looking for more information and generating an alternative. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's clear. So the first step, which is about helping people to slow down the thoughts.
Yeah.
So if I understand it correctly, you could experience and check that the graphical bubbles moving and moving slowly, it has been, let's say, demonstrated that it's enough for them. It just this design visual effect helps them to slow down? Or is it also because of what is happening during the sessions, the interview sessions? So maybe I have two questions. What is the relation between what's happening in the session and then the effect of the app in between the session for the person? But if I understand, to slow down my thinking, I will be able to do it only thanks to this bubble that reminds me to, right? And how do you explain this effect? How these bubbles are able to do that? Is it because of the sessions? Is it because of something else?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So we think absolutely the sessions are essential. The learning with the therapist is key. One thing I didn't mention is that we also do going outside of the clinic room with the person. with the mobile app to support them in using it in real life and working towards their goal. So the process of slowing down is something that's supported by the tasks within session that the person works through with the therapist. And then as you say, then the mobile app becomes a prompt to apply the learning that's been used within sessions. I think where the slowing down bubble visualization is helpful is that in moments of distress, we know that our ability to recall information is obviously impacted. And so the bubble becomes a sort of simple, at a glance reminder of that process of slowing down. There's also potentially something, I mean, we've not tested this empirically, but the act of slowing down the bubble, sort of physically having to interact with the screen to slow it down, kind of can, you know, arguably psychologically, that's a somewhat grounding motion. It supports people to kind of connect to the moment and the thought and be less caught up kind of internally. But the other thing I would say as well is we found that people used the mobile app in different ways to support them to slow down. So not everyone went through that full cycle with tapping the slow down bubble. People could, as you saw Alex do, just flip between their worries and their safer thoughts. That was what was on the home screen. And so some people just shortcutted and went straight to their safer thoughts as a way of kind of just thinking, well, what's going to help me feel better in this moment? And that's something we're really looking at in detail around version 2, is how can we have multiple routes to slowing down within the app, which might suit different users. So some people really like that process of going through in a lot of detail, and for other people that's too long-winded and they want something much simpler to use. Yeah.
Thank you. I will save time for other questions from other people.
I have a question.
Sure.
I have a question. Okay, I'm not sure if I understood well about the functioning of the therapy sessions with therapists and the main functions of the app. Is it automatically linked together? We have to have sessions before with the therapist in order to work the other tasks in the app? And the other half part of the question, could we use the app without the therapy, even after having the first, let's say 8 weeks, we have the exercise and we learn to slow down. And then after a while, we decide to come back to the app by ourselves, being independent from the therapist. Can we use it? I heard that it's not an app meant to be used indefinitely. So at some point we have some learning, but if we want to come back, could we still have new functions or something to remember our first sessions?
Yes, thank you. Really good questions. And yes, sorry, I wasn't clear on those issues. So in relation to how the sessions and the mobile app interact, so within the sessions, the mobile app is introduced. So say, for example, in session 1, people on the web app with the therapist enter their main worries. They start to notice their main worries. As the person gets towards the end of that session, the therapist will share with them the Slow-Mo mobile app and their user profile and synchronize them to highlight how the person's worries and any safer thoughts they might have started to notice are now on the app home screen. And the person can then go away and use the app to monitor their worries after the session. And then each week, based on the learning in the session, a new bit of the mobile app will unlock. So at the end of every session, there's a review of the mobile app, looking at what new content is unlocked and a planning of how the person will continue to use that outside of session. So they are very much synchronized. They work hand in hand. And for our population of people with psychosis, we think that those sessions with a therapist are key. There was a lot of excitement about standalone digital therapeutics. For severe mental health, the emerging evidence is suggesting that they're not effective. It makes sense that you would also need kind of some form of clinician support. that might be able to be light to touch than with conventional therapies. And certainly with slow-mo, we think we could train up a less experienced workforce to deliver it. That's something we're going to try as part of the implementation study. And then in relation to the second part of your question, yeah, absolutely. So although our ideal is that people internalize the skills from the app, of course, if people continue to find it a helpful support, then we'd encourage their use. And one of the ways, exactly as you say, that it might be helpful is that after sort of people have, you know, ended therapy for a while, they might want a refresher, and going back to the app could be a helpful booster. I didn't show you today, but one of the other functionalities of the app is within the burger menu, people can access a short summary of each session. And it has a text or an audio recording note, depending on what people prefer, of what the main thing that they learned from the session, and also how they want to use what they've learned going forward. So it's a really nice sort of brief but on the money summary for people of what they did through their slow-mo journey. And again, that's something we're looking to improve even more for version 2. So how it could become sort of a useful library and repository for the person to refer back to.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Did you have a question, Brigitte, or did I made a mistake? No, I think no. Okay, so I have a lot of other questions also, not from my side, but I can see Diane's hands. Maybe you want to ask something, Diane?
Stéphane, yes, Amy, well, that's an amazing presentation and really impressive work there. Yeah, it's really, really incredible. And I was wondering if you had a similar version for young people, well, children and young populations at all.
Yeah, thank you for that kind feedback. We don't currently, but we do absolutely think that the interface of slow-mo could be repurposed for other populations and other problems. In terms of a medical device regulation piece, that's quite a considerable undertaking. So we're focusing on paranoia and psychosis in adults in this first instance, but certainly in the future, we would be interested to look at other populations, yeah.
Yeah, actually, sorry.
No, please.
Yeah, on the medical device part, are you applying for yes, medical device? Okay.
Or no, not applying, sorry. So we are registered. We have a UK CA as a class 1 medical device.
Right.
Yeah, developing version 2 to re-register it. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. I was wondering a few other things more related to the development process. I was wondering, can you just remind us how long it took to develop it? I mean, for the day one, and then how long it took to have something that is usable, and it would be interesting to know more. And also related to that, did you develop only Android, iOS app, both? How did you manage this technical stuff and timings?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, all very good questions. And I suppose one thing I'd say about the time is obviously the time taken to develop anything is obviously proportionate to the workforce capacity you have inputting to it. So in some ways our timescale was impacted by that. I work half of my time in the NHS as a clinician, my other half of my time is for research, and slow-mo probably equates to about 10% of my time. So it was challenging fitting in a design research process like this. We started in 2014. The scheme with the RCA was that they have a design associate working on the project for 3 days a week. What I really valued, and I appreciate even more now in hindsight, is the level of detail of the design research at the RCA. I think their scheme allowed for a greater depth than perhaps might often be possible from a commercial design studio. I say that not as a designer, and so I'm aware I might be misunderstanding things, and apologies if so. So yeah, so we started in 2013 and the RCT started in 2017. So it was about 4 years of us getting this together. What I would say though is we did some side projects along the way, which I've not mentioned today. So we investigated wearable integration as part of that work. We also developed a standalone version of Slow-Mo for the general population called Mo, which didn't really progress, but we repurposed some of the functionality back into Slow-Mo. We have a game called Go-Mo for distraction and a relaxation exercise called Flow-Mo, which again, I didn't mention today, but they are also really nice assets to boost engagement. So yeah, so it was a long time. And I think one of the challenges about doing this type of work within a sort of psychology or psychiatry mental health setting is our teams and our funders are not, I mean, it's changing, I think, but certainly back then were not set up to sort of factor in that level of that amount of time for developing an intervention. You know, it's fascinating, I think, how long it takes us to conduct RCTs and to gather that data, and yet the assumption is the intervention is ready to go within, you know, a month or two. You just use what you've already got, and then, you know, certainly within psychological therapies, at least, I appreciate the processes may be different in other approaches, but there's relatively less weight placed on intervention development in a way that I think is fascinating in research. So we had to use a lot of internal funding for the development and sort of get funding from different pools. We didn't have a pot of money to develop it. Our research councils now do have better funding schemes for developing these types of products. So that's a really helpful improvement. So yeah, so that's how long it took us. For Slow-Mo version 2, though, for example, we're aiming to develop that within a year, and that will include all our medical device documentation as well. So yeah, we are speeding up slightly. And I've just sort of, and then the second part of your question was how we went about coding it. So because of our population having marked socioeconomic deprivation, we didn't code in iOS on purpose, because in the UK, iOS is more expensive in terms of contracts. So we knew Android would make most sense initially. We also chose to code it as a native mobile app, so it doesn't require a data package. The therapist would put the app online when someone came into session in order to sync the data, so that we had the analytics data and also had the data sharing for therapy. And that was, yeah, partly because of the economic issue, but also partly because of the nature of our users and the nature of paranoia. We wanted to make sure people felt in control of their data and that they chose whether or not they shared it, not that that was kind of imposed by a clinical team or the clinician. That being said, for version 2, we are planning to develop it in iOS and on Android, which makes more sense if we're moving to kind of scale it up now. But yeah, for that initial version, and it's a challenge as well, because, you know, the message we got back then was, and I think that makes sense, is keep things, you know, to the smallest scale you can. Don't waste additional funding on development until you know if it works. But then the challenge then, once you have demonstrated it works in an RCT, is you have an MVP that's not suitable to implement at scale. And so hence why we're now going back to developing version 2.
Cool. Does it mean that now version 2 will be something that is, how to say, more sustainable in time? I mean, because this first version for RCT was a kind of proof of concept, or was it already in use with many patients? Or and do you plan to scale up with many users? And if yes, how do you imagine it could work? Does it need a company? How does this can work?
Yeah, big questions. So in terms of who's used Slow-Mo currently, we only tested it in the RCT. So that was with 362 people in the RCT, 181 in the therapy group. So I mean, our team very much wouldn't disseminate slow-mo more widely until we'd demonstrated that it was effective. So that was kind of a necessary condition for us. The version we have, as I said, kind of doesn't work cross-device. It's only scaled for certain devices and things, so that's problematic. We do, within my clinical service now, a couple of our frontline clinicians are piloting slow-mo just to see how it goes outside an RCT context, and they're really liking using it and getting positive feedback from their service users. But yeah, in terms of the next steps, one of the constraints on us sharing slow-mo more widely now is because it is a medical device, and so that places requirements on us in terms of being able to monitor safety, maintain the software. And one of the challenges of that, going back to the workforce capacity, is we obviously don't have a customer services team who can support that, and we don't have anyone within our workforce who can be doing that on a day-to-day basis. So, and also we really want to share the version 2 more widely. So version 2 will be tested on 150 people is the plan, but the hope is, alongside that, once we get the team up, infrastructure and architecture up for running that study, and we've recertified version 2, we could start to scale it in the NHS at that point. So hopefully later on next year or early the year after. Yeah, you know, and time will tell how much it's adopted and who does kind of use it and take it forward. The business model by which we distribute it is still a work in progress, and again presents a lot of challenges to us as clinical academics when, you know, we are not used to working in industry. We have gone through an accelerator scheme last year, and hopefully we'll repeat that this year, and that was somewhat helpful. But I think if university, you know, clinical academic groups are going to be developing digital therapeutics, you know, arguably there's a need for the academic organisations to be developing the infrastructure to support them to spin out. So that's something we're in discussions about currently, yeah. And if anyone has any bright ideas on how we can do that.
Yeah. Huge perspectives. Thank you. I think we're close to the end, but Diane, you had a question, it seems, right?
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. I did, but actually you answered it. It was about your business model, but also I guess I was wondering if you were approaching, you know, other apps that would be assessing, for example, or evaluating mental health disorders. So that can be nicely signposting to your app typically.
Yes, so in terms of organisations like Orca, did you have in mind?
Not really, but well, I guess the NHS can, well, probably through certain teams, they can. I'm talking more about partnerships with other private sector organizations.
Oh, I see. Yes. I mean, licensing is definitely another model. Well, I suppose either licensing or signposting could be, yeah, other models to consider. Yes, we've not made too much progress with that yet, but that is something we are exploring. And we certainly want to go through the process of having a NICE approval. So that's our kind of UK best practice guidelines in healthcare. So the evidence that we generate from the implementation study will hopefully allow us to go through the NICE approval. And if we have endorsement by NICE, then that also will support scale up and spread.
And are you envisaging other, oh, sorry.
No.
I was just wondering, so you were mentioning this implementation study on 150 people. Are you envisaging other implementation studies running in parallel, or is that the only one that will lead you to the stage of scaling up later on?
So in the first instance, our plan is to focus on that implementation study, and we think that should generate this evidence we need for the NICE approval process. Of course, these things are evolving, and this, you know, the situation might change in terms of what's required for that. But as I said, our hope is that alongside that, once we've got Slow-Mo 2 recertified, we can put Slow-Mo out into the wild, so to speak. And the other thing that's then advantageous about that as a medical device is we then move into, as I understand it, more kind of post-market research territory, where we can conduct or collect data in a arguably more efficient way than if we were doing it under clinical research governance. So yeah, the hope is that we can start to accrue a wider data set of implementation, but some of that will be through kind of NHS research and some will be post-market research.
Right, because I mean, I guess at King's College, would there be any appetite to, you know, deploy on student populations? I mean, I know, well, there's been quite a few issues raised in Cambridge, for example, students that you know, had suicidal thoughts, and not just thoughts, actually killed themselves. So there's a whole initiative now to look at how we can address these issues a bit better, prevent, and also offer support to the students. So yeah, I was wondering if King's College was doing something similar. It's a bit of a side question, but.
But no, an interesting point, well, and relevant to us all, obviously being university-based, or those of us here who are university-based. I mean, student mental health and well-being is certainly a significant priority at King's, and one of my colleagues is sort of leading approaches around that. So yeah, that could be an application for Slow-Mo going forward, definitely.
Thank you. I think we will slowly progress to the second part of the webinar. It's amazing, all questions that your group raised, so it's very interesting. Thank you so much. I had two last questions, but I offer you to respond to it in the chat or in parallel, so I just mention it. The first was about something you said about the difference between the standalone approach to digital therapeutics, digital tools for health, and the one that you developed, which is more guided, which is guided by a therapist and so. And you said, and I liked it a lot, that because of the specific population you had to deal with, you made the choice to don't avoid something that would be standalone, but to have something that is guided. But I was thinking, is it possible that this idea would also be of value for everybody? I mean, there is a kind of utopia with the digital tools for mental health, like it's something magical that's going to be the new future innovative thing that will solve everything, blah, 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 which is the usual innovation startup discourse. But it would be interesting to know more about what you think about the relevance of 100% standalone approaches in digital treatments, because a lot of startups also are trying to develop like ICBT, or even some governments, even in Canada, are offering online ICBT programs. I don't think we have enough stats on how people use it and how efficient it is at the large scale, but I would tend to think that it's a kind of a myth or a kind of illusion that it's going to be a super great breakthrough. And I suppose that I would like to suppose that the importance of the relationships between the clinicians and the person, that would be something that is maybe specific to health and even more specific to mental health approach to care, and that maybe it's a mistake to believe that it's possible to make everything standalone. So it would be interesting to hear you about that in the chat if you want. And the second quick question is that maybe you told about that, but I didn't catch it. I was wondering, how did you get in touch with RCA students and colleagues to have a design research approach at the beginning? Yeah, that would be good to know. So We can put something on the chat if you want, because it's time to go to the second presentation. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm sorry to say that we must conclude here and go to the end from now. From here, I can see some comments also from Amy in the chat, so you can take a look at it at the end. So I'd like to thank you warmly, both of you, for your participation today in our webinar. It was very interesting for us to have fresh news and insights from projects and what is being done in UK with design, with either with digital or non-digital, mental health or not, or just health in general. So thank you so much for this. It was a pleasure to have you with us right now. I can see that the sky is black in UK across your window, both of you. So I must say good evening and good night for you. Thank you for being there a bit late. And thank you for all our participants to be with us today. So thank you so much. And let's keep in touch for our collaborations or activities. So